Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan here in Tokyo, Marunouchi. I'm Anthony Rowley, I'm former president of the club, and I shall be acting as moderator today. This is the latest in what we call our deep dive series, in which we ask panels of experts to look at topics of current interest. And the topic we've chosen today, we've entitled Startup Companies in Japan and Asia, Boom Time, query. And to discuss this subject, important subject, I think we have three eminent experts. We have joining us online from New York, Richard Katz, who is special correspondent for the weekly Toyo Keizai and a senior fellow at the Carnegie Council for the Asia Dialogues program. And joining us somewhat closer also online is Keiichi Aritomo, who is Executive Director of FinCity Tokyo and co-founder and board director of the Japan International Asset Management Consortium, or JIAM. And joining us also this time from Manila is Suzanne Gaboury, who is Director General for Private Sector Operations at the Asian Development Bank in Manila, the ADB. So thank you all for joining us. Obviously at the moment, a lot of people are more concerned, I think, with the possibility of a global recession, and in which case the incidence of corporate bankruptcies seems likely to rise, especially among smaller companies. But I think it's timely and appropriate to take a look at things from what I would call the other end of the spectrum, that of prospects for startup companies in Japan and Asia, since that's where the future lies. I think the world in general, and investors in particular, have focused very strongly in recent times on high-tech startup companies and the role of venture capital. This is understandable, given the remarkable degree of innovation we've seen in this sector. But of course, the startup universe is about much more than just high-tech companies. And in any case, tech stocks have taken something of a battering in stock markets recently. So I think the question we want to look at today is how should policies be shaped to encourage the growth of a dynamic but balanced and sustainable startup culture in Asia, one that's well supplied with financial, technological, and human resources. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to the first of our speakers, Richard Katz. I'll just say a little more about his background. He is, as I said, a special correspondent for the weekly Toyo Keizai and a Carnegie Council Senior Fellow for Asia Dialogues program. He's authored 2 books on Japan, Japan, the System That Soured, The Rise and Fall of the Japanese Economic Miracle, and quotes Japanese Phoenix, The Long Road to Economic Revival. He's taught on Japan as an adjunct professor in economics at the State University in New York, Stony Brook, and at the New York University Stern School of Business. His new book, to be published early next year in English and Japanese, is tentatively called The Contest for Japan's Economic Future. So, Richard, would you take over from here, please?
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me, and I wish I could be there in person. You know, when you use the word entrepreneur...
Sorry, we can't hear you too well. Could you speak a little closer maybe to the microphone?
Okay, is that better?
It's getting better, yes.
I can hear you very well. I can hear Richard very well. So it's probably, Anthony, your side of the problem.
Anybody else having a problem besides Anthony? No,
no problem.
Can everyone in the room hear? You can. All right, so go ahead.
Okay, so as Anthony said, he stole my line. You know, when most people hear the word startup or hear the word entrepreneur, what they think of is a bunch of sort of geeky, single 20-year-old guys in Silicon Valley with cigarettes and empty diet cans all over the place, Diet Coke cans or not diet, and taking millions of dollars in venture capital money to invest sort of whiz-bang technologies like artificial intelligence or cryptocurrencies or quantum computing and things of this type. And Prime Minister Kishida is unfortunately one of the ones with that image. Now, Silicon Valley and things like it are absolutely glorious and absolutely essential to the economy, but they're really such a thin slice of what is really the entrepreneurial community. In the United States, in all of Silicon Valley, there are 2,000 high-tech companies. But if you take what the OECD, that is the international authorities, regard as high growth enterprises, like are growing at least 20% a year for several years, there are 50,000 of those in the United States, about 22,000 of those in Italy, about 10 to 15,000 of those in Korea, Britain, France, etc. How many are there in Japan? We don't know. And the reason we don't know is that Japan does not measure this. And if governments measure what they consider important, it's kind of telling that they don't measure it. And that's, so that Japan is flying blind. Now, the first problem with that image, as I said, it's a small share of what is the startup community. And it also, this fascination with these very, very innovative technologies, what really makes countries grow is not so much the invention of these technologies, it's the application of them to real economic needs. The technologies can be invented all over the world and any country can import them. And let me give you two examples of really superb entrepreneurial startups in Japan. One sponsored by venture capital, one not, and see what a typical startup is in Japan. Typical startup, there are all over Japan what are called food deserts, which is towns that have gotten depopulated so much so that they can no longer be served by a grocery store. There's no grocery store there. The supermarkets did nothing about this. And then a 42-year-old community organizer in Tokushima invented a company that drives trucks from town to town. It's got about 1,500 items on it that it buys from the supermarkets on consignment, but doesn't sell, they can be returned. And it goes from town to town. And now they've got almost 1,000 trucks. They started 10 years ago. They've got almost 1,000 trucks all over Japan. They're serving people. They were bought up now by a bigger company, so we don't know the revenues. The revenues were 60 million before they were bought up. There's nothing high-tech about that. What is an innovative person who sees a need that the market is not filling and finds a way to fill it. And when he does, or she does, then the bigger companies that never even saw the problem, let alone a solution, begin to cooperate with them and begin to move. Just like Tesla forced the big automakers to think about electric vehicles that they had not done so before. Now, the other example is a company called Roxul that was developed by a 23-year-old graduate 1 year out of Keio, did have venture capital. And all they did was they didn't invent anything special. They just took technology off the shelf to create a website that was kind of an Uber model for parcel delivery for trucks. So what was the result of that? Now they're all over Tokyo. The result was that trucks that were before delivering that last mile delivery, which were only 40% full, are now a lot fuller because they have an auction that says, hey, I'm going on that route. I'll add that package for this amount of money. Now, not only does the truck earn more money and the trucker, because they can carry more packages for every mile. Think about this. If they're carrying more packages, then there are fewer carbon emissions for every package they deliver. So the impact on the economy can really be quite huge. The only problem is there should be hundreds of companies doing exactly what they're doing, and hopefully the competition will do it. Now, these companies are called high growth enterprises by the OECD, but the ones under 5 years old are called gazelles, which is the name of an African antelope, variety of antelope. It's very, very fast because they grow quickly and very agile. And the traditional companies are called elephants because elephants are powerful and they're smart. But once they're on a certain path, it's very hard for them to change with the times. In the United States, 60% of the entire growth in manufacturing productivity in the last couple of decades was created by companies under 5 years old. 14,000 companies are the fastest growing companies in America. They're an average of about 8 years old. In Japan, we know that we don't know how many gazelles there are, but academics who've looked at it say they're about 40% more productive, more efficient than an older company that has more output per worker or per work hour. In Japan, as in elsewhere, these elephants are a real problem. You need the elephants, but if you only have elephants and no gazelles, you're in trouble. The older a company is in Japan, the less efficient it is and the less it grows. The problem is that in the high growth era, Japan was promoting gazelles. But since the late 70s, it stopped promoting them and still only promoted either the elephants or the zombies. Now, Kishida says he's trying to change that. Let's see what he's aiming for and whether he'll do it. But before we get to that, why don't we have more gazelles? Some people will say it's a cultural problem, that Japanese are taught to be risk averse, they're conformist, whatever, they're not entrepreneurial. And in my opinion, to be somewhat impolite, the idea is nonsense. Yes, every country has its culture, but the entrepreneurship built the Meiji era rapid industrialization. Entrepreneurship built the economic miracle after the war. It was not culture, it was politics. When you actually done surveys of American and Japanese MBAs and French and Indians, you find the Americans and the Japanese, that is Masters of Business Administration, people go to grad school to learn how to run companies. They express very similar attitudes like, I want to see my idea become reality, even against opposition. I love nothing more than fighting the status quo. So culture is not the problem. The problem is that in Japan, the system is skewed, is biased, so that the risk for success is really quite low. And the penalty for failure is really quite high. Just think of the lifetime employment system. If you take the chance to start a company or work for a startup, going from a big company, and you fail, you cannot get that kind of lucrative job again. Now, it's terrific that Prime Minister says he wants to fix that. There are a couple problems. One is, again, too much focus on the Silicon Valley venture capital market when that's such a thin slice. Secondly, I'm sorry to say this, but Kishida, like Abe before him, is very good on expressing lofty goals and very poor on providing the measures that say, how do you reach that goals? There was a committee, it was part of the New Capitalism Council. It was run by the Science and Technology Council within the government. The people working on it were superb bureaucrats, outside business people, academics. They did a superb first-rate analysis of what the obstacles were, but there were no solutions provided, no, not recommended, nothing. And when I asked people involved, they said, well, they were told by the Kishida administration, wait till after the election, wait till the end of the year. We're going to have a 5-year plan and come up with something. We don't want anything in there that might show the government is internally divided. So for example, METI, the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, has over the years provided a number of very good, very practical suggestions that would help startups. And I'll go through them in a minute. But the Finance Ministry, Tax Bureau has cut them down because some of them involve tax incentives. And they say we can't afford the tax to lose this tax revenue. And to my view, this is penny wise, pound foolish, because if the country grows faster, the tax revenue will grow. So what are the things that Kishida could have done, should have done, if he's willing to get into fights with Kate Onren, with more conservative sections of the Liberal Democratic Party, and with the Tax Bureau of the Finance Ministry? Well, one issue that startups have is, under a lifetime employment system, can you recruit people? Well, that's actually changing now because of a generational change, which is younger people are much more willing and eager to work for a startup, get in the ground floor. Also, women who now go to four-year colleges with the expectation of a career find they go to a traditional company and they can't get promotions. So they're flocking to these startups. You just walk in the door, you see so many women managers. But it's still an issue. And one of the things that would help is that they could provide stock options to recruit very, very talented people. And stock options are made so they can't afford to pay a high salary, but people will go work for them if they know if the company succeeds, they'll become rich later. They will do that. But it's so cumbersome in Japan, it's almost useless, and companies don't want to use it. A very basic issue in Japan is probably the most important problem right now is financing. I'd be very curious to hear Suzanne's ideas on this. Banks won't lend to startup companies. In fact, banks charge a 10-year-old company with no problems a higher interest rate than it'll charge a 50-year-old company that's a zombie because of the political pressure to fund zombies. But most startups are not funded by venture capital. They're funded by what's called angels, which is people who put money into companies that neither need nor can use venture capital. In fact, an entrepreneur in Japan said giving a company like this, the food company I mentioned, Tokushimaru, giving them venture capital is like putting rocket fuel in your Prius. I mean, you just don't want to see the result of that. Well, METI had proposed, a very great official there named Keiichi, leadership on a lot of these issues, proposed tax breaks for angel investors, similar to what was in the United Kingdom. And METI supported him in this, and the tax bureau said, no, can't do it, we can't afford it. Another issue is there's something called the limited liability company. Now, an ordinary corporation has got what's called double taxation. When the company earns money, it pays taxes. When it gets dividends to the investors, they pay taxes. The limited liability company began in the United States and spread to other companies. It's only taxed once, and yet has all the protections from lawsuits, et cetera, that a corporation does. You can't take your house because your company goes bankrupt. Well, again, METI said, let's do it like in the UK, like in the US, like elsewhere, and the double taxation. Again, the tax ministry said no. Companies need to spend money on R&D, research and development, even if they're not in high tech. And yet only 8% of all of the government's financial aid to R&D in Japan goes to companies with fewer than 250 employees. That's the worst rate in the entire OECD. If you want them to be successful, they got to change how they do R&D and make sure these startups can have access to it. One of the other issues is that these new companies often have a problem. They don't know how to manage. For example, the guy who started Rocksool, he was a visionary. He started this fantastic company only a year out of college, so he had no idea how to manage a company, manage people. And he was having every year 40 to 50% of his people would leave to find another job. He didn't know what to do about it. What he did was he hired a bunch of people in their 30s who had become managers at bigger firms. They had reached the level of each kacho, a section head. They knew how to manage people. And what they found is Rocksool was not talking to people about the mission of the company, just talking about management. How they were changing Japan by doing their business. They started talking to them about the mission of the company, and suddenly within a couple of years, they got that turnover rate down from 40 or 50% per year to 5 or 10% a year. Management training is very hard. Well, all over Japan, there are these people who have been managers who are forced to retire at age 60. They would love to work, but they don't want to work full time. They'll be consultants. If you could pay them stock options, you would have the ability to have these people help out. They would get rich, and the company would gain the benefit of their managerial wisdom. And one final thing I'll mention, which is the country talks a lot about digitization. Suga talked about it. Kishida talked about it. It's great, but this is not about ending the honko in tax in government offices. This is about the private business community. There's a company called a consulting company called IMD that measures world competitiveness in various areas. They looked at 64 countries and what they call their business agility in handling digital technology. That is, how are they able to get the company to take best advantage of the technology that's out there? Japan came in number 62 out of 64. In the training of Japanese students in schools for digital skills and therefore the skills of the labor force, Japan came in dead last at 64. Other countries, particularly in Europe, have all these kinds of programs to help small and medium enterprises in understanding how to use digital technology to help them grow better. That's an example. The issue isn't the technology per se. It's taking that technology, making a better product, or knowing how to use it. So there are a number of very practical things that could be done. These are not revolutionary. They're very practical. They're very, very day-to-day. They're very doable. They're not being done. The government is telling the people who worked on the reforms, wait till the end of the year. We're going to have a 5-year program. And talking to these people, they hope they will, but they're not very confident they will. They are truly afraid that once again, the prime minister will set out lofty goals, but no measures to achieve them. And I must say, I share, unfortunately, I'm sorry to say this, but I do share that lack of confidence. But still, I also share the hope that they will find a way to overcome this, if not with this prime minister, maybe with the next. So let me stop there. Thank you very much again for inviting me, and I'm eager to hear the other contributions.
Thank you, Richard. Some provocative thoughts. For a moment, I thought I'd stumbled into the zoo this morning when you started talking about elephants and gazelles, but you didn't mention dinosaurs or whales. Okay, well, let's now turn to the financial culture in Japan as it affects startups. And to do that, we'll ask Keiichi Aritomo, who, as I said before, is Executive Director of FinCity Tokyo. He's also a co-founder and board director of the Consortium for Japan International Asset Management Center and Asia head of Kensho Technologies, a leading financial artificial intelligence solution provider and a subsidiary of S&P, Standard & Poor's. He was formerly a partner at McKinsey & Company, Deloitte and PwC, where he specialized in financial services industry and technology strategies across North America, Europe, Southeast Asia, and Japan. He's co-authored several books, including A Single View of Customer for Financial Institutions, published from Keizai and Shanghai Communications University Press, both in Japanese and Mandarin. So, Aritomo-san, if you would take the floor, please.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now. Yep.
Yeah. Oh, much for introducing myself. I think it's more important to talk about our chairman, who posted, but I'm speaking on his behalf. Our chairman is Mr. Hiroshi Nakaso, who used to run Bank of Japan, and in fact, he is kind of expected to run Bank of Japan again as a governor. He's also chairing quite important committees such as Financial Services Agency, FSA's Policy Evaluation Committee. And we now have quite significant fund by the name of University Fund, the University Fund with $100 billion of AUM. He's a chair for the monitoring committee as well. Okay. So my background is a bit boring, especially I'm not too proud of my consulting experience because consulting is all, quite frankly, all about bullshitting about everything. But I'm proud of my experience, startup experience with Kensho. Kensho was founded in Harvard Square in Massachusetts. And then I was involved in Series A, and I led the launch of Japan business and expansion to actually involved in Series B and expansion to Asia, and eventually acquired by S&P for $500 million. So this is a real experience, business experience. Again, consulting is not a real experience; it's an extension business school. So let me talk about the our organization, FinCity Tokyo. I kind of persuaded Governor Koike to make it happen back in 2016-17 when she got elected to the governor of Tokyo. She formulated advisor panel with the aspiration to turn around Tokyo as a global financial hub back in 2016 when she became the governor. We had a series of discussions together with sector leaders such as chair of Japan Bankers Association, International Bankers Association, JSTA, Japan Security Dealers Association, Japan Investment Advisory Association, etc. So I was appointed as the deputy chair to sort of the coordinating with all the board members to shape the strategy for Tokyo. Now, if you take a look, there seems to be a kind of obvious, but we decided to focus on asset management and fintech. At that time, still fintech was a buzzword, right? But the reason why is we have to solve social issues. Finance is not for financiers or bankers. Finance is for ordinary people to address the social issues. So nowadays, ESG is a kind of common sense, right? Everyone talks about ESG, but at that time it was still new in Japan. What we do is fourfold. We disseminate information without any propaganda. Sometimes we have to disseminate information which is quite embarrassing about taxation, as Richard mentioned. Right? There are some weird taxation in Japan. I agree, and we are trying to fix those anomalies of our taxation. And we obtain feedback from both international and domestic stakeholders, candid feedback, right? And we also try to attract financial professionals or innovative investment managers, fintech entrepreneurs, etc. And then we put together policy recommendations and then recommend to policymakers and government officials, etc. And some of them are kind of incorporated or reflected or taken into account for the policy decisions as well. So those are the things we do. There are quite a few misunderstandings about who we are. Given that our organization is new, and this is a kind of few new organization, very new in terms of public-private joint venture. We oftentimes misunderstood as the additional trade associations representing industry's benefits. But we are not working for the industry. We're working for the Japan-based residents, including international people, as well as the Japanese nationals. And we also make sure that we provide sufficient funding for the entire supply chains, including small and medium enterprises, etc. We also try to attract foreign talents, professionals, but we are not necessarily promoting preferential policies for foreigners. Instead, we try to make Tokyo more diversified and inclusive, etc. And we are quite active in policy recommendation in taxation, but we are not promoting preferential policy for high net worth individuals. But as you must be aware, Japan has many millionaires, although we have very few billionaires, unlike the US. But in terms of the number of population millionaires, we have, according to Credit Suisse report 2021, we have 3.8 million millionaires, while China has 5.7 million millionaires. Although China has 10 times as many people as in terms of population compared to Japan. So here's our framework for activities. Why financial centers, right? People don't necessarily understand why financial center is needed. And as I mentioned earlier, oftentimes financial center is considered for financial institutions. This is not the case as far as Tokyo is concerned. We have very strong driving forces, tailwind, geopolitics. You can say anything in Japan. You can criticize Prime Minister Kishida without getting jailed. This is very rare in Asia. Probably we are the only or most fully, full-fledged democratic jurisdiction in Asia, right? Because we are so democratic, decision-making is so slow. But we cherish democracy. Pandemic was disastrous, but to some extent, it was fortunate to drive our digital transformation. People can work remotely without spending hour and a half for commuting in packed train cars. And carbon neutrality target and demographic challenge. We are the most aged society in the world, right? But within a few decades, Korea and China are going to surpass Japan in terms of aging. So in this sense, our experiment would be highly relevant to the rest of Asia. What we do, we are driving through 3 engines. One is the upgrading investment chain, investor orientation. And then second is sustainability. Third is supply chain finance. This pandemic and also the war in Ukraine exposed Japanese vulnerabilities in supply chains. We have to make our supply chains more resilient. But in order to do so, we have to provide sufficient funding for SMEs, constituents of end-to-end supply chains. And our goals are quite simple. We like to utilize our household wealth for growth. And then, etc. We need to achieve carbon neutrality through digitalization, digital transformation, etc. We have been supported by quite a few organizations. Unfortunately or fortunately, at this point, 70% of our funding is from Tokyo Metropolitan Government. We have to make it more balanced, right? But we have been supported by quite a few reputable organizations to drive Tokyo Financial Center turnaround. There's a lot of catching up required. Let me, one thing which is quite notable on this list is actually University of Tokyo, which is quite interesting because University of Tokyo used to produce a lot of bureaucrats, right? And the senior bureaucrats. But nowadays, their attitude is towards entrepreneurs. And this is the first time University of Tokyo joined this kind of membership-based organization. It used to be professor by professor. So the reason why is they're kind of committed to become more relevant to investment value chain. They're committed to become an investor as well as the issuer. In addition to being a manufacturer of smart kits. So, so this is the latest development, which may be quite interesting as well. Here's one of our initiatives. We have 10 projects taking place, and we might be doing too many, but this is one of our important projects, and highly supported by Governor Koike, Disclosure G, standing for Green Global Governance. So here's the Japanese situation. I'm less concerned about the early stage startups. We are more concerned about SMEs listed on TSE. Because as Richard mentioned, our culture is very risk averse, and employment is lifetime oriented, right? But we actually observe quite a few increasing number of entrepreneurs coming out of the universities. And in fact, we have quite a few STEM universities in countryside, right? STEM meaning science, technology, engineering, mathematics. People don't know much about the universities outside Tokyo. Like University of Tokyo, Keio, Waseda, people know about those universities. But there are quite a few national universities with engineering and science degrees. And they are actually highly aspirational. But the issue is that there are lots of support available. Venture capitalists and brokerage firms, lawyers, accountants, helping them to get listed. After getting listed, it's done and dusted. And then oftentimes this is the highest valuation. And then oftentimes those are sold to retail investors, right? And because although they started with very strong aspiration to address social issues, by the time they get listed, they're left alone. and also they're exhausted. And then they don't have enough capacity and capability to effectively engage international investors and communicate what they are trying to do, their story in English, let alone their adherence to ESG, right? So I'm more concerned about listed SMEs. Listing IPO market capitalization as a point of the IPO in Japan is probably equivalent to Series A in the US, right? So they are very premature. So I don't think our issue is here at the early stage, before pre-IPO, after IPO, or maybe IPO is too early, right? And they end up have a very low ESG rating, limited traction from overseas investors, low liquidity. It's a vicious cycle. We have more than 3,800 listed companies in Japan, number 3 in the world, following India and US, rivaling the US. But only less than 150 companies are covered by, analysts. So, which means that 35 or 3,600 companies are irrelevant from an international investor's point of view. What we have studied under the Governor Koike's instruction, as well as Chairman Nakaso's instruction, is to start helping them better communicate and engage international investors. We cannot do it too much, but we selected 5 companies last year. We are helping 15 companies this year to better communicate, because as Richard mentioned, there are some hidden gems in Japan, not known, yet to be known to the world. But they don't know how to, they don't know how to communicate, how to engage as well. So that's what we have been doing. So hopefully it's gonna turn around and provide better liquidity and better valuation for those companies. But what we want to have is more like international investors who are patient enough to pay attention to those companies as well. Another issue is ESG bubble. There are lots of bullshit going on around ESG. Famous ones are BWS scandal or HSBC scandal, whatever. But those are not really, tip of iceberg. It's not new to us, because whenever we go to supermarket to buy consumer products, we are dealing with greenwashing, right? We know, we are getting educated how to make a distinction between, real green and greenwashing for consumer products as well, right? But for investment, it's less obvious, right? And here's the Japanese situation as well. So as you must be aware, our institutional investors, especially GPIF, are gigantic. And because they are so gigantic, and they can only engage large, long-only, major Japan-based asset managers, right? The size of the ticket is huge, at least $1 billion for each, things like that, right? So small boutique asset managers cannot digest this kind of ticket size. And they also, allocate or outsource to sub-advisors as well. But oftentimes, most of the time, for as far as equity is concerned, allocation are to large manufacturers or large service providers, right? And they have sufficient internal resources to put together ESG reporting to make sure that they are ESG compliant. This is not the issue. We are less concerned about the reporting for ESG by top tier companies, because they can easily outsource whatever non-compliant to lower tier suppliers in emerging markets. it's and done, dusted. It doesn't resolve the problem at all. Our issue is the entire supply chain. We have to make it more resilient. We have to make it more transparent as well. But we don't have solutions yet. We have tools to assess each individual corporate's ESG compliance or affiliations, rating, etc. But doesn't matter because what we have to deal with end-to-end supply chains. So for the audience, we are looking for any investment professionals or investment solutions to address those greenwashing, data-driven, not by the reporting based. Okay. And last and least, we are quite active in social media, but still we only have 7,000 Twitter followers and LinkedIn followers. So we like you to follow more, and we are disseminating quite interesting and important information about our ecosystem as well. Thank you very much for listening, and back to you, Anthony.
Thank you very much, Aritomo-san. We'll return to some of your points in question time, I'm sure. Okay, now we'll go to Suzanne Gaboury. I have to apologize to Suzanne. We've given you a huge canvas to cover Asia, but perhaps you can pick out some of the more interesting trends, which of the countries in Asia outside of Japan are having success in promoting startup companies and smaller enterprises. So let me just say briefly that Suzanne is, as I said before, Director General of the Asian Development Bank's Private Sector Operations Department. Before joining the ADB, she was Chief Investment Officer at FinDev, Canada, where she was responsible for strategic vision, including defining business markets, clients, product investment strategies, and development. She's a national of Canada. She holds a BA in economics from the University of Alberta in Canada and a master's degree in business administration from the UCD Michael Smurfit Graduate Business School in Ireland. So, Suzanne, please.
Good morning, and thank you very much. I hope you can hear me properly. So I'm very grateful to see everyone here in attendance. I know it's very early to discuss what I think is a very dynamic topic in Asia and the Pacific, and the role that Japan can play in strengthening the startup ecosystem across the region. And Anthony, thank you very much for your kind invitation to this deep dive roundtable with Richard and Aritomo-san. As mentioned, my name is Suzanne Gaboury. I'm Director General for the Asian Development Bank's private sector operations throughout Asia and the Pacific. And it's very much my pleasure to be here today to deliver a speech and have a discussion on how startups are changing the region and why collaboration between different ecosystems and ecosystem players across various markets in Asia is so important. We've heard some of these comments already made and alluded to. So again, very important. Technology is penetrating every facet of our lives, and no matter where we live. A driving force behind this fundamental transformation of how people live has been the emergence of technology startups. And we've seen this emphasized throughout the COVID pandemic period. Aside from creating vast amounts of economic wealth and wealth globally, technological innovation and digital platforms have long assisted underserved segments of ADB's own developing member countries with benefits including giving individuals and households access access to cheaper goods and essential services, including financial services or healthcare for greater convenience or wider choices, helping traditional businesses, especially micro SMEs, achieve efficiencies and access previously unreachable markets, and simplifying logistics and integrating value chains across borders, making them vehicles for regional integration and cooperation. Of course, there is a valid concern that the spotlight on technology and digital startups have left traditional micro SMEs on the sidelines without attention or resources, as we've already heard. And unfortunately, the nature of venture capital means that this sort of growth-oriented capital is not necessarily fit for micro SMEs, which operate with a different personality. They're better served by loans or debt financing, perhaps in the lower to middle market private equity players and investors. Yet not enough affordable debt capital, as we've heard, is available to these SMEs or even some startups for that matter. And this is exactly why many startups have started to focus on solving problems, including that of access to capital for micro SMEs, which lead to a symbiotic relationship. For example, Fairbank Inc. is a Adb Ventures portfolio company which makes credit access available to micro retailers in Indonesia. So Adb has established a Adb Ventures program where we actually support startups and venture capital type investments across the region in Asia and Pacific. So we recognize that for technology to have sustainable development impact in the region, more investment is needed in policy, infrastructure, and capital mobilization. And just as venture capitalists, lower to middle income private equity investors, technology startups, and traditional micro SMEs each have their own roles to play in developing the economy, various institutions across both the public and private sectors, such as Adb and the government of Japan, can play an important collaborative roles in nurturing the regional startup and innovative ecosystems. But first, in an ever-changing landscape, we've heard, Anthony in his introduction about the concerns out there. I've just come from numerous trips, both in Europe and Singapore, as well as Canada, to hear about the concerns for our current very dynamic business environment. And with this ever-changing landscape of business models and technologies, requires governments to re-examine policy in areas including competition, data access, privacy, security, and taxation. Again, all issues which have already been raised. Changing labor markets challenge governments to reskill and upskill workers while updating labor and social protection policies. A second challenge is infrastructure. For many, the affordability of devices and data plans, as well as access to electricity, still determine participation in the digital economy. Adb estimates that the region will need to invest almost $1 trillion over the next 5 years in mobile and broadband services. And much of this investment will come from the private sector. We know that in the region, with fiscal balance sheets strained with the dealing with post-COVID and with COVID and the ensuing economic impacts of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, this is where many of the types of investments will come from. Finally, enabling the private sector capital mobilization is crucial in ensuring that these startups have the fuel to grow, to take advantage of these policies and infrastructure improvements to maximize the economic value created. And without private capital participation, the ecosystem will not develop further and will not mature properly. And so what have we done? What has Adb done to address these gaps? What we've done is that we're providing financing for digital infrastructure, digital technology industries through an improved business environment, support for research and development or enhanced competitiveness, digital technology startups through ecosystem development and impact investment, digital services, digital technology policy and strategy, data analytics and insights, such as leveraging public Earth observation data from satellites for disaster risk reduction or intelligent agriculture, and digital technology, capacity development, and upskilling. As I mentioned, Adb launched Adb Ventures. This was done in 2020 to actively back early stage, high impact startups that will benefit Asia and the Pacific and mobilize both public and private funding into the regional impact investing space. Adb Ventures is one of the tools that we have within our private sector operations division, which currently focuses on climate technologies. And it's there's a number of technologies across the space in financial institutions, in agribusiness, across a number of things, energy. And it's really looking at investing in climate technologies emerging Asia through its inaugural equity fund. And it's one of the many equity tools that we have. So we have tools both in debt and equity up and down the balance sheet so that we can actually serve our clients better. And this particular platform is currently mobilizing funding for its debt capital fund, which, as we've heard, there's a lack of access to, and exploring the expansion of another equity offering. So our vision is that it will mobilize $1 billion for climate-focused technology in emerging Asia by 2030. And in Japan is a country which has one of the deepest relationships with ADB, has seen increasing venture capital and startup activities. Not only Japanese corporates pushing for innovation throughout their value cycle and supply chains in the region, but the country itself has actually attracted 4.5 billion in venture capital funding in 2021, up nearly 7-fold in the last 10 years. So this is a huge increase. Japanese startups on average raised an extra round or two of funding the last year due to the abundance of growth equity available. We envisage that these startups will increasingly explore new market opportunities beyond Japan for more growth and value creation, and can only imagine that the venture capital ecosystem will pick up even more velocity in the years to come. But as we've mentioned, there are some some backgrounds, some foundational work that I think that needs to be put in place in order for this to happen. But allow me to close out by reinforcing our ADB's keen interest in developing our partnership with Japanese stakeholders on various digital technology and innovative related initiatives. And we believe that close collaboration between ADB, Japanese institutions, and the government can further contribute to regional innovation by increasing co-financing opportunities for startup and investments, including climate-focused technology, and assisting with outbound technology transfer to other Asia-Pacific markets. And I would also like to express my thanks to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan for hosting this deep dive event. I think that this is an area which we think has a great opportunity, great interest, and also, many of the things that we've seen, we're talking about what is the policy side, and many of these things may be coming into the Q&A. And I think that it's one of the focus that probably needs to happen is that focusing on the ecosystems, focusing on ecosystems that are outward and just don't focus on the domestic. So with that, and thank you to all the partners and stakeholders that are here. And ADB can continue to innovate and tackle the enormous changes. And we look forward to the Q&A part. And thank you very much for this discussion this morning and beyond.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed. Okay, we're going to turn to question time now, questions rather. First, if there are any questions from the floor, happy to take a question from the floor. Yes, this gentleman here. Please go to the microphone, identify yourself and ask your question. And if your question is for one particular person, say who it's addressed to, please.
Hi, this is Ken Yasunaga. I'm doing the venture capital for the past more than 20 years. I recently managing director of the government fund. Right now, I'm raising fund to invest to the Japanese startup who is willing to go global. So I have one question to Richard. And I think, Richard, I met you when I was working for INCJ. If you look at China or India, there's a lot of role that American investor or global investor played to really boost the venture economy on each of that market. And we don't see much of that in Japan. Last year, there's many foreign investor has invested in startup, especially in the late stage SaaS company. But we believe that with the market crash in these days, those money will be gone next year. So what can we do as a venture, speaking at, talking as the like representing venture ecosystem in Japan, what can we do to attract more foreign investors in this country?
Okay,
Richard,
sure.
you take that first, and maybe Aritomo-san would like to say something to Basil, please.
Yes, thank you for the question. You know, the problem in Japan, actually someone at InkJ, I said, is that a chicken and egg problem? The people don't become entrepreneurs because they think they can't get money. And then the entrepreneurs don't invest because they think there are no, the VC companies don't invest because they don't think there are enough good entrepreneurs to invest in. And I was told by this high executive at InkJ that, no, it's just an egg problem. There are no good entrepreneurs in Japan. Well, that's not the way to attract foreign money. It's also not true. It's pretty easy to start a company in Japan. What's hard to do is to make it grow because of all the kind of barriers I mentioned. At a certain stage, companies do need bank loans, and the Financial Services Agency could adjust guidelines in various ways so that credit-worthy companies that are 10 years old or 5 years old can get bank loans. The personal guarantee is a big problem. Government procurement. New companies need money. The government purchases of goods and services is 16% of Japan's GDP. The government sets aside a large portion of that for small and medium enterprises, most of which are old. Japan has got the oldest and smallest, low-growing SMEs in the entire rich country sector. They should be setting aside money. They can do that, that's fine, but they should be setting aside money for new, innovative companies. They began saying they were doing so in 2015, but in fact, they never even met their goal, which is a very, very meager goal. If these companies were getting that kind of sales and revenue, that means they would get credibility among private consumers. They would also, banks would be more willing to lend to them. Outside investors would be much more willing to lend to them. So that's just one of many steps that Japan, from the government side, could be doing to change policies that would enable these companies to be much more attractive. And the other thing is stop running down Japan and saying it doesn't have any good entrepreneurs. It's got tons of good entrepreneurs if they had the opportunities and a better risk-reward ratio.
Okay. Aritomo-san, you made some points about foreign investment in Japanese startups and SMEs. Do you want to add something quickly there?
Yeah, I have a lot to say, but
Briefly.
Briefly, right? So one thing Richard made a very important point. Asset allocation among Japanese institutional investors, especially pension funds. So we conducted interview with global asset owners, including more sizable pension funds in the world. Interviewed with 14 asset owners. They have some quota for venture investment, plus also like emerging manager investments allocation, allocating to emerging managers, who is also allocating to startup firms and SMEs as well. This portion is always debatable, even among large pension funds like Carnegie or Norway's Norges, and GIC as well. The portion is less than 50 basis points of entire AUM, but they have to have small portion of this quota, and which is zero in Japan. In Japanese institutional investors. So if it's zero, there's no way to build a pipeline of talent, right? So this is the most important one. And it cannot be zero. It could be, we can start from 10 basis points, but we have to start from something. That out of many things I want to say that's the most important one. I like to emphasize.
Okay, thank you. Any questions online? Any more questions from the floor? Oh yes, please. Microphone. There's a microphone over there. If you please say who you are and who your question is addressed to.
Excellent. Good morning, everyone. My name is Asa Questenberry. I'm the founder and president of Dronex Kabushi Gaisha, a small startup from Osaka. We founded a couple years ago, focused on the air mobility sector, things such as air taxis, drone deliveries, autonomous drones, systems. So first, I just want to thank the FCCJ for putting together this event. Again, Richard Katz, Keiichi-san, Suzanne, I think spot on with a lot of their assumptions. As a foreign startup entrepreneur in Japan, I can say firsthand a lot of these challenges we've definitely experienced. So one disconnect that I always find is how do we bring more people who are involved in the day-to-day realities of entrepreneurism and startups in Japan into the policy-making process? So one example I have, the ACCJ, the American Chamber of Commerce Japan, is looking to put together a startup task force, but the members they've chosen for this task force have no experience in startups. So it's always from the outside looking in. So my question in general for the panelists, anyone in particular, what do you think, what are some of the hurdles associated with bringing more entrepreneurs and startup founders into the policy creation process? The people that are in the day-to-day reality need to have a more hands-on role in shaping the policy that will help their businesses thrive in the Japanese startup ecosystem. So, thank you.
Thank you. Maybe Aritomo-san, you'd like to kick off that one, would you?
That's a very important question, right? Policymakers have no entrepreneurial experience. And even like people in finance or manufacturing or decision makers have no experience in starting their own businesses from scratch. That's the reality. And unlike the US, they are now also super duper wealthy to spend their own money to make things happen as well, right? Because of lifetime employment. And interestingly, if you are executive of a large corporate, 1/3 of your lifetime income is pension benefits, right? So you cannot leave the company. That's a situation. You are stuck, right? So this question is also like entrepreneurs don't know how to influence government either. It's to be honest, even ACCJ knows which button to press. Americans tend to be loud and quite vocal, but hoping somebody is gonna listen and then take it into a digestible pieces of policies, recommendations, actionable and feasible. So I'm not criticizing ACCJ. ACCJ has been doing a great job, and we need ACCJ's job, but we have to bring input and then put together actionable policy recommendation. Who has to do exactly what and changing what, which law of which clause or which article we have to adjust, kind of things. Right. Well, what kind of government regulation or regulatory policies and guidelines have to be addressed? So there's a huge gap between, startup community and policy making. So, to some extent, we are trying to play a role in between this startup community and the policy making. So that's why we are committed to speak with not only large market participants, but also like small and medium enterprises. We even speak to manufacturer suppliers in a Sumida world as well. So we are happy to discuss further on if you have any questions. We are happy to take it to incorporate into our policy recommendation. Okay.
Perhaps I could use this opportunity to broaden that question a little bit and bring in Suzanne Gaboury too, because There are many actors involved: banks, capital markets, entrepreneurs, governments, and it's all rather fragmented in a way. And it seems to me, perhaps I'm being a little bit bureaucratic in my thinking, that what we need is a more integrated approach. And Suzanne, I wonder whether the ADB could play a bigger role in this sense by providing, I don't know, a service or providing governments with advice on how to try to standardize the approach to these problems, make people more aware generally of the importance of the SME and startup sector, not just in Japan, but throughout Asia, and find ways to make policy more effective. Regional integration is one of your missions. What about, regional initiatives on startups? Is there a more institutionalized approach, if you understand what I mean?
No, thank you very much for that. And I really appreciated the comments and the questions which have come. Regional integration is part of it. I think that for, startups and the entrepreneurs that come with that, there are a number of things that can be done. First, overall, in a general basis, ADB has both public and private types of instruments and approaches under one roof. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to work with our various member countries in helping to create what I would call the enabling environment and advising on policy side of things. This is more focused to our countries in which we can invest, which are developing member countries. But equally, it applies to our countries in which, are shareholders, helping to create that right environment for developing those skills, making those connections with the policymakers. Some of the things that I've seen in other countries is where you have investor roundtables. Like I know, having a roundtable in and of itself is maybe not the most effective tool, but when you have a roundtable where you have domestic and regional investors, you have the government policymakers there, the government ministries who are responsible, you can actually have a concrete discussion as to what are the impediments to investment, be it from the legal side, due to the financial lack of financial resources, but then you'd have to have very much actionable outcomes and accountabilities for that, because otherwise things kind of get left on the table. One of the biggest things I think in the region, I think that and generally in some parts of Asia, has been previously mentioned, is risk appetite. And that within the banking sector is generally where, as we've mentioned, banks often can be risk adverse. So it's a matter of also having those concrete discussions to ensure that banks absolutely realize there is the short term and the long term. Maybe in the short term that you won't get your immediate returns or investments, but in the longer term, you are creating employment. We know that SMEs are the biggest employer globally of an individual class. It's not any one particular large company. And so I think when you look at those kinds of issues and you figure out with the government itself, what are their issues and how you can help solve that with the issues that, where are your crossovers? I think that, one of the things that has already been mentioned about actionable policy with concrete recommendations, that's the thing, is that you should prioritize what the issues are, what the concerns are, because if you try and bite off everything, the likelihood of succeeding on that is much lower. So with some very practical kind of advice on that, but I have seen, the investor roundtable where you have buy-in from senior levels of government all the way down to engage with business to action and solve issues. I've seen that to be quite effective.
Okay.
Anthony, could I add a couple words on that, if I may?
Yes, of course, I was going to ask you actually. Does it, please?
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm afraid we're boring people because we're agreeing too much. But anyway, that being said, there's something called the Association of Japan Association of a New Economy. This is created by Rakuten's Mikitani several years ago, It's got hundreds of members of really entrepreneurial firms ranging in size from giants like Rakuten to smaller firms. And they've begun to lobby, but they're not always invited to these advisory councils as they ought to be. You know, I have this book coming out, and I'm not saying it to plug the book, but to how I wrote the book. How I began writing the book was just going around and meeting entrepreneurs. Again, not just the ones going on the stock market, on all sorts of levels, and introduced to a lot of them by a fellow at METI, who's very, very eager and very sincere about getting startups off the ground. And I said, give me a list of one or two things that the government could do, or banks could, other people could do, but the government could do to change private behavior. Not the government replacing private behavior, but the government catalyzing private behavior that would make a real difference to the number of startups. And they all had tremendous ideas. And so my book is really, not that I didn't do any work, but a lot of it's a compilation of other people's ideas. These people and what they need is something like this association to really lobby, and the ACCJ to really lobby, say, get some people with that experience on these advisory councils. By the way, also get them into the research consortium at universities, or these public-private consortiums, which again, just invite the old elephants and none of the new gazelles.
Okay, all right. Any more questions from the floor or online? Any questions online? No. Well, I have a point, another question, which is, you know, we had this fantastic tech boom, obviously. People are speaking of it now as a tech wreck, but and very much focused on huge companies which achieved unbelievable market capitalizations. They made their entrepreneurs fantastically rich. That boom seems to be going, if not exactly bust, it's definitely deflating now. Now, what impact is this going to have on, perhaps on psychology towards smaller enterprises? Could capital markets now turn their attention more, do you think, to the smaller enterprises and startups as a result of the disillusionment, if you like, with big tech? In that sense, could stock markets become a more powerful instrument to make good the gaps that banks and even venture capital companies are leaving? Richard, perhaps first on that. Would you like to say something about that?
Yes, every time you have a new technology that's at all worthwhile, and some that are not worthwhile, you have a boom and then you have a bust. If I asked you how many American companies produced cars between 1895 and 1930s that rose and died, the number is 1,200, which means that 99.7% of all car companies, and some failed, and some of them ran gasoline, and some of them burned wood, and some of them ran on steam, and believe it or not, some even used batteries. Can you imagine using a battery for a car? Who can imagine? So the point is, every new company is an experiment, and most new companies fail. But the few that succeed change the universe. So now, in any worthwhile technology, most will fail, and people have to learn that's the way it is. On the other hand, there are some technologies, and I would say cryptocurrencies are among them, which destroy wealth rather than creating it by basically chewing up all the electricity that Aritomo-san showed in his slide. So they deserve. Blockchain is a fantastic technology. Cryptocurrency, not so much. And that wreck, I don't mind.
Okay. Suzanne, I'm one of perhaps relatively few people who believe that multilateral development banks are underused. They have this fantastic structure for raising capital at low cost and so on. Given the perhaps clouded outlook for stock markets, now do you think that the development banks might make a case for a more active role, recapitalization maybe, but a more active role in areas such as encouraging smaller companies? Because after all, these are so important for the future.
Thanks, Richard. You give me some very challenging questions, so thank you for that. But I do think that now with the external environment, the uncertainties there, I've said this, with, in many discussions recently, that I think the role of development finance institutions and development MDBs, I think, is probably more relevant now than at any other time. I think that there's more uncertainty in the market probably now over the last 20 years. And with that, I think that the MDBs with their long-term views, I think can provide that stability. We are reaching out more into the market. We are trying to find those solutions because we don't want to displace a private sector solution, private capital that's already available. But our role is to actually provide financing and risk capital for those investments to stimulate the economies. Just as a comment about tech boom, tech wreck, I would, sorry, Richard, I'm agreeing with you on some of those things once again, which is not a bad thing. But I think that, it's what your view is of technology. I think that is changing completely. I think where we've seen, the big investments before, we're not seeing it in the traditional technology sectors, anything. I think the innovation is looking in other things. From clean technology to fintech to agritech to all kinds of other things in the technology space that if you have these good ideas, I do believe, agree that not everything is going to be successful, but there is a wide range of ideas out there. Will, MDBs go for recapitalization? That's a very hot topic right now. As you can see that many of our shareholders, ADB has some 68 shareholders from around the world. And those governments, some of them are already expressing or feeling that they may not be able to come up with additional capital. I don't know, but many of them have already responded on COVID response. So this is where the role of the private sector comes in, is that the increasing expectation is that not only can the private sector aspect of not only the MDBs, but the private sector itself provide the capital that's needed, they're going to be the source of the innovation. They're going to be the source of the ideas and stuff as well. So we're here to be as a facilitator. We're here to actually make the connections and try and help to create those enabling environments for the attraction and investment of private sector. So it's a very dynamic market. And I would agree with you, all the sentiments that I've been hearing, it's a clouded outlook right now. And I think that not only is it the macroeconomic environment, inflation that people are concerned about, but it's actually food security and what that means for many of these countries. So there's a lot of uncertainty there, but I think that there are opportunities. Good companies can get investment, but it is a tough market. That's the general sentiment. I was just came from a conference in Amsterdam last night, and basically the general sentiment is that there are opportunities, there is funding there, but the market is getting tougher.
Okay. Very interesting point you raised there about agri-tech. I mean, these are not such glamorous areas but they're very important. Aritomo-san, I mean, are Japanese investors sufficiently aware, do you think, of the many sectors outside of high tech, such as agriculture is terribly important to Japan, marketing, produce, and so on? Is FinCity doing anything to help sectors like that?
We don't work directly with agri-tech per se, but as I mentioned, as part of our project, we are not excluding agri-tech or healthcare tech, but we are helping SMEs, listed SME, to better engage investors. So at some point, those companies might be involved in FinCity Tokyo's activities as well. But I think to your previous question, tech bubble, tech wreck. I think I'm less concerned about tech wreck because this is a kind of a good opportunity to gauge capability of investment professionals, right? In the past, we didn't know it's based upon luck or real capabilities as investors. And I also spoke with many companies saying that, self-claiming that they are AI-enabled or blockchain-enabled. And if you have decent conversation with many of those entrepreneurs, founders, do you really need blockchain to do this business? Oftentimes, 99% of my experience, you don't need blockchain. What kind of social issues are you trying to solve? Do you need this gigantic or highly complicated algorithm to address until over engineering? And oftentimes, like AI-enabled investment, how exactly are you using AI? And they can answer. And most of the time, it's more like a marketing tool to say like it's AI enabled. It's AI. Oftentimes AI has nothing to do with investment strategy as well. So it's a good timing to conduct reality check. And technology is not for the sake of technology. Technology might be useful to address the problem we are solving, but oftentimes we end up talking about the solution or technology itself. Same for ESG. ESG is not for the sake of ESG as well. So I think I'm less concerned about this market situation.
Okay, thank you. One more round of questions. Do you any more questions? Questions online? No one online. Wait a minute, Saito-san, you have something. Sorry, can you? Oh, sorry. Okay.
From the question from Jack Farrer.
Can I speak to, who was it?
Jack Fowler.
Jack Fowler. If you're online, can you, if you have a question, please ask. Mr. Fowler.
Oh, sorry. I was just commenting, but yeah, I think this is a tendency in the software engineering space for people to try to reach for all the fancy technologies rather than just focusing on solving the problem in the simplest way. But yeah, so tendency to use these AI or blockchain. So that's just my experience from the software space. So just commenting on that.
Okay, all right.
Sorry.
Don't worry, that's fine. Richard, before we, do you have any parting comment you want? You look as though you have a point you wanted to make.
So, I'm not sure that's a good thing or not. Yeah, there's a couple points I want to make, more than we have time for, but let me just make two. One is, in terms of the government role in financing, actually three quick ones. They're going to have the government pension fund. They say they're going to have them fund money to venture capitalists. I hope to God the pension fund itself is not trying to invest in startups. They have no skill. But on the other hand, if they invest in a fund of funds, of private investment, including foreign ones, in answer to the previous question, that would be a big help. And Suzanne may or may not have some comments on that. In terms of the use of technology, there's a guy, one of Japan's newest billionaires, just used a very, very simple use of the web to put together people who earn over $60,000 a year, and they're veterans of their company, they're in their 40s, who would like to quit their big company and get in the ground floor of something smaller so they can feel creative in their career. And now he's a billionaire, which shows there is a big demand of people who would like to do something creative, would like to switch jobs. And to use technology for that purpose is the social purpose.
Mm.
It's not about the technology. It's really about the purpose. And I guess let me stop there.
Okay, very important point, I think, huge wasted resource. By the way, if I could just say in passing to Suzanne Gaboury that I often think that a lot of the good things you do down there in Manila are not sufficiently well publicized. Manila is a little bit off the map, really, and I think you need to spread the message more broadly. I shan't be popular with the media staff for saying that, but I think, you know, that there are good things going on down there we don't always know about. Okay, well, we've had from my point of view, quite an interesting discussion. I think it would lend itself to a further discussion. There's obviously enormous number of countries to discuss. There's a lot more to discuss. So let me thank our three panelists very much for giving your expert views. You will all receive a 1-year honorary membership to the club, probably on its way already, I hope. And please.
Will they let us back into the country to use it?
I think so, yes, I think.
If you could arrange that, that would be nice.
We'll see what we can do. But even there are limits even to the FCCJ's power, but we'll see what we can do. Anyway, on behalf of the club, let me thank you all, to the experts in particular, and we look forward to the next opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.